Let's talk about a couple of pests. So a lot of you knew what this was at the beginning, aphids. So how do you know that they're aphids? They just look like them, right? So if you look at the rear end, actually, they have these two tailpipes. Okay, that's the main characteristic for aphids. Okay, small, soft-bodied, but the two tailpipes. Okay, they're aphids. Now, aphids have a lot of interesting life cycles, depending on the species, but here's just the general one. So aphids actually overwinter. They can overwinter in the egg stage on woody plants. So this could be on trees, woody shrubs. This is considered the primary host. In the spring, they can actually have several generations on that woody host. Then they'll produce these winged form aphids that then fly to a secondary host. And this can be our annual plants. It could be other ornamentals in the area. And there you have an asexual female aphid that then just starts to pump out mini aphids, babies, right? And as we were talking about at the break, aphids, they're kind of like those Russian dolls where you open one and there's another one. And so the next little one here is really prepared, and as it develops, is already getting prepared to start laying, having more aphid babies. And so, again, they're reproducing asexually. And so you can have multiple generations exploding really quickly. And maybe you've noticed this on some of your plants where you have a small population of aphids. Within a couple days, they're in the thousands and even more, right? So towards the end of the season, then they'll produce winged forms. They'll migrate back to their primary host. In this case, we'll also get males being produced at some point. We're only available for a small amount of time and mate, and then the eggs are laid on those woody plants to then spend the winter. So that's kind of a general life cycle for aphids. We know that they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, as we talked about earlier, feed on phloem. They produce that honeydew that we talked about, reproduce rapidly. They can cause damage to the leaves. We saw some curled leaves earlier. Honeydew, again, can promote that sooty mold. Aphids can transmit diseases to plants, too. And so just recognizing that, there's some aphids that can cause disease. Okay. For management, if the honeydew is really a major nuisance, you'll want to consider, and also you have this leaf curl that's pretty severe, you'll want to consider some type of management. At bud break, dormant oils can work here with pyrethroids. That helps to at least suffocate some of those egg stages. Even some of the aphids that are within that plant or on that plant. In the spring and summer, insecticidal soaps, even just a stiff spray of water. They're very soft-bodied insects, and so you can really bring down that population quite well. With the insecticidal soaps, that helps to take away some of the waxes off of the insect. It also takes away the surface tension of the water so that the insects actually are enveloped by the water and they drown. So that can be a way that actually helps with suppressing aphids. Some of these systemic insecticides, those insecticides that move into the plant or absorbed into that plant, are ways to manage aphids, because remember, they're feeding, their mouth parts are stuck in that leaf, so they're able to then ingest some of that product. Biological control, I'll talk about some of the beneficial insects like parasitic wasps, lady beetles, lacewings. Those can be helpful for aphids. Let's see, just because of time, let's go to squash bugs. Okay. So, how many of you have seen the eggs? Everybody, I hope. No. Or maybe not. I would hope not, but everybody's probably seen them. How many squish the eggs? All right, egg squishers. So we know that on the undersides of leaves usually, right? They do have the incomplete metamorphosis, so the nymphs look a lot like the adults, except they're smaller. Eventually they get to be about this size, right? They are gregarious, so that's why you see them in massive clumps a lot of times. Very good hiders, too. They can hide in the cracks and crevices of the soil, especially where the stem of the plant hits into that soil. So got to look for them. We know that they feed on cucurbits. Saliva. Some people have thought that the saliva was toxic and that's what causes the wilting of the plant, but actually it's not toxic. It's that those piercing, sucky mouth parts jab the stems so much that they disrupt the xylem vessel, so water flow is really disrupted and then you get wilting there. They overwinter as adults in debris. So right now you could probably look around debris areas. It could be weedy parts of your property. It could be maybe you have a wood pile. That could be an area where you might find some of these squash bugs right now. Yes?
So would that be an example of where tillage might be beneficial?
It could, only if you were leaving debris within, let's say if you left all your cucurbit debris in your yard, in that garden, you might be able to kill some of them in there. But in terms of here, mostly sanitation's a big component of management of squash bugs. So looking at those wood piles or somehow creating barriers so that way they're not hiding out in those areas is one way to do that. So the other thing with sanitation is actually cleaning up. So after the season's done, how many of you took out all of this material? A couple of you. What about the rest of you? So really, for squash bugs, they're really keyed in on these cucurbit plants. You have to get that debris out. The other thing is that we don't often recommend, especially if you have problems with squash bugs, we don't recommend that you compost this material because the chemicals are still there that are cueing in squash bugs back into the area. Also, you're not getting hot enough compost, I don't think, to kill one, weed seeds, but also some of the stages that might be there of these insects. Yes?
Does putting it in the ground count as
Not a, you really got to take it out. I would, especially if you always have a problem. I mean, this goes back to if you always have a problem and you're just trying to figure out how to get rid of them because there's so much of a problem, I would say you got to get it out. If you don't, you could till it in, but then eventually over time you might start to see more of an issue down the line. So you really got to get that material out. If you don't have a neighbor, where do I dispose of it? You have a neighbor you don't like, maybe take it there. Large nymphs in adults are difficult to control, as you know. Cultural controls, so removing that garden debris, the wood piles, those protected sites where those adults are able to overwinter, that's what you want to manage as best you can. One that I didn't put in here, but floating row covers are another way. So even this year, so as the adults start to make their way out and you have new plants growing, if you have some type of physical barrier that helps them from not even getting onto those plants, that's a good way too to help with that population. They like to hide out on the undersides usually of wood. If you have wood kind of laying flat, maybe you have that row cover where you have then a couple of 2x4s or something just kind of holding everything down. They actually will kind of hide their way in there, but then you can at least clear out that spot and they're not actually laying all the eggs on the plant itself. So that would be another strategy here. Chemical sprays, at the first sign of those nymphs, if you're going to use chemicals, when the nymphs are small, because when they get bigger, they're less susceptible. Diatomaceous earth, some people have used that as well. Again, when they're small, because as they get bigger, it's not as effective. Also, the application has to be pretty good cover because where are they at? They're on the undersides of leaves, right? They're in the stems, kind of making their way down by where the soil's at as well. So you got to get good coverage. Yes?
Do the sprays have any effect on eggs?
No, a lot of the sprays do not have an effect on eggs. So your own physical egg squishing is actually helpful in that case. There isn't a whole lot for the eggs. Yes.
And if you spray chemicals, you'll kill the pollinators, and squash needs pollinators.
Exactly. Yep. So you definitely have to be careful with your sprays and flowers for pollinators. Yes.
How far away, if you have wood piles or other things that they might be living in over the winter, how far away does that need to be from your garden space?
That's a hard question. I mean, I would actually just look to see look at those piles and see whether or not you find those adults hiding out there. I had heard of a case of somebody that just had a small greenhouse or something next to their garden where they had put pots kind of for the winter and had everything lined up in that greenhouse. And they had looked that next spring and moved the pots around, and they were all hiding out kind of in the pots. And that, I mean, it wasn't even real debris. It was just kind of potting material. I mean, really just, you got to look to see, but if you can cover those areas, that could be helpful. Even if they were close, but if you covered them, you might get concentration of them where maybe you're putting rocks over a tarp and they're just kind of hiding out in that area instead, but at least you can sweep them up or do something about that concentrated area a lot easier than them being kind of spread out within a wood pile.
If you see one or two, does that mean that they're going to be more later?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it's a pretty good chance, and they're pretty good at hiding. A lot like tomato hornworms too. All of a sudden, they're just so big, and you do wonder how they even got there, right? In terms of, there's a lot of resistant varieties. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't know how many of you enjoy butternut and royal acorn squash. I mean, those are good, but a lot of people actually like to grow everything on the susceptible side, right? And so, but we do have a fact sheet on this more specifically, but it tells you which of these plants are more resistant and which ones are more susceptible. So realizing that as well. So you might consider kind of adjusting your planting so that way you also have some resistant varieties there too. You know, think about this long term. Let's talk about a couple of the good insects, just so that way we know what they look like. Praying mantid egg case. Have any of you seen that before? Yep. If you didn't know it was, now you're informed. Okay. Kind of looks like that insulating spray foam. But out of this, you get multiple praying mantids exiting out. Okay. They're generalists. They don't care that they're eating their siblings. They're going to eat anything. They just want food, source of some type, and it's usually another insect. So oftentimes, I don't encourage at least purchasing praying mantids because, they do eat insects, but they're generalists, and they're not actively seeking out the pests that you want. Okay. But damselbugs, these aren't available commercially, but they're residents in a lot of different settings. Gardens, they're probably in your garden already getting ready for the spring. But fairly small, about half the size of a penny, fairly thin looking insect, piercing sucking mouth parts, has a modified front leg, much like that praying mantid. Kind of an in-betweener in terms of being a sit-and-wait predator and sort of an active predator. It'll seek out prey. They'll feed on eggs of different types of insects. They'll feed on aphids, whiteflies, small larvae, large larvae. They're general, so they'll feed on a lot of different things. Really good predators, but the main thing is identifying them, knowing which ones are the good ones. So this is a really good one. Very abundant as well. Big-eyed bug's another one that's pretty abundant. Has piercing, sucking mouth parts. It is a very small insect, so you really have to be watching out for it. It scurries very fast. It doesn't want to be seen by you, so even when I've gone to collect them, they'll flip underneath a leaf or fall to the ground and go into the soil really quickly. But they can be quite abundant as well. They do have big eyes, but they're really small insects. And here's the nymph stage, so that's going to be a really tiny insect. Here's some lookalikes. Chinch bugs are the ones that I find are maybe they kind of closely look like them. Lady beetles, as I talked about earlier, knowing the larval stage, and these are the same species. So these are better predators, I feel, than even the adults because they don't fly. They're going to stay in the local area. I don't encourage also buying lady beetles because they do fly away when you release them. If you have to buy lady beetles, you just have to because you've never done it before, but you want to. What I would encourage is if you have a plant that has aphids on it, you might just put a little net over it, throw a couple of these lady beetles in, hope that they mate. and that they lay eggs. And there's not a lot of insects that lay eggs like this that are this football yellow color and laid in this clutch. So if you see eggs like that, the lady beetles are everywhere. So even if you find these eggs around your place, consider moving them around, and then what's going to emerge are the lady beetle larvae. Those are actually going to be really good for you. In a greenhouse setting, maybe a high tunnel, even a low tunnel if you keep it closed early on and you have some insect problems, adults could work in that situation because you have a room. You're enclosing it and things are going to be kept together. Out in the open, they're gone. You see your money fly away. Predatory ground beetles. Here's one that kind of looks like what people know as a stink bug or stink beetle. This one won't lift its rear end up in the air though. Look at those mandibles up front. Here's a tiger beetle adult. Their larvae are also predatory, so you might find these in the soil. This one is also in the soil, anchors itself, flips out to catch its prey, and then goes back in its little hole. A lot of different predatory ground beetles, though. How many of you have seen lacewings? A lot of you. So have you seen the eggs as well? So they're often laid on these silken stalks. And so here's the egg and here's the silk. Once you have an eye for it, it's kind of weird. It's almost like crossing your eyes, and you kind of get that level of vision where you'll see the eggs off of the leaf because they're just hanging off the leaf a little bit. But off of there will emerge this alligator-looking larva. That's the lacewing larva. Very good predator. And these are actually sold commercially in the adult stages. The adults aren't predatory. There is one species where we find them feeding, but the larval stages are the predatory stage. Okay, and they do sell them in the larval stage as well. So as I talked about, generalists, siblings, they'll feed on each other. Predators will feed on each other as well, but they feed on a lot of other things. So parasitoid wasps. How many of you have seen the movie Alien or Aliens? This is going back to the 70s, 80s, right? So they actually got their inspiration from, I think, these insects. So this is an aphid, okay? You know how small aphids are. Here's a parasitic wasp that lays its egg in an aphid, develops as a larva, pupates, and then eventually emerges as this adult wasp, ready to go and attack other aphids. These are resident in the area. And so what you want to look for are aphids, one, that look a lot different from the rest of the population. They tend to be gold in color, sometimes black in color. They're not moving either because they're dead. All that's left is this exoskeleton because the wasp is developing in there. We call these aphid mummies. Now, if the wasp emerge, you'll see a little hole at the rear end here. So that's another indication that the aphid was parasitized and the wasp has emerged and is out and about, probably laying more eggs than other aphids. So these are around, good guys to have around. Here's a tomato hornworm. This wasp will lay multiple eggs in a single larva. So each one of these is a pupal case of a wasp. So multiple wasps will emerge out of each of those little white Q-tip looking things. So the idea here is when you go into your garden, when you're looking at these particular pests that you're used to seeing, if they look very peculiar, if you know that this doesn't look like your typical tomato hornworm, but the idea is you probably have beneficials in the area. It's just looking for those particular cues. So parasitoid wasps, there's some that attack whiteflies specifically. If you have a greenhouse situation, this would actually be one that could work for you where you can purchase these online and apply them in your greenhouse. There's some that attack eggs specifically. So this tiny wasp lays an egg in the egg of a moth or a butterfly and develops the same way as I just mentioned, and then the wasp emerges out to go and attack other eggs. With that, I thank you for your attention. Visit our website. I have my contact information there.